Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We're going to talk chapter two now, the internet, digital media, and media convergence. This is going to be a fairly long chapter, so make sure that you have a cup of coffee or something to kind of relax and enjoy with. And again, at some point during this lecture, I'm going to be giving you an extra credit word that you can later answer on a quiz and get some extra points for. So anyway, but fascinating chapter, the internet, digital media, media convergence, all things that we started to talk about in chapter one, but we're going to get into greater detail with chapter two. But before we get into the meat of the matter here, I wanted to show you this. That is a television, and one of the things that's very interesting about me is that being that I'm 59 years old, yes, I'm a dinosaur. I was born in 1966, and we are now in 2026. So you do the math, I'm going to be 60, just like the Super Bowl this year. So in any event, the reason I'm showing this to you is because I am from a very unique generation where certain things that you are used to came along during my lifetime, and certain things that you are used to came along during my lifetime. Actually, I should say, or I was born into. I guess that's kind of a clunky way of saying that. But in any event, so the reason I have this television up there is because this actually very much resembled my first television. This is what I can remember of it. This is not the exact television, obviously. It's just a facsimile, if you will, a picture, but basically that's what it looked like. And, essentially the quality of picture wasn't all that great. There was no such thing as a remote control. You see those little dials on the right-hand side of the screen there. You'd actually physically have to get off the couch or a chair to go turn those channels. And you also had like rabbit ears that would go up, up like this, and you'd have to adjust them for the clarity of signal. It was pretty primitive. I'm not going to lie. When we get to television, I'm going to tell you when cable came along, and obviously, I'm more of a cable baby than anything, and that was my first television. This was my first flip phone, or phone, I should say. I don't have a shot of a pager, but in terms of like being able to instantly communicate with me, I first started carrying around a pager. No one knows what that is in 2026, but basically when I worked for a production company down in Hollywood, when I was in my late 20s, if they needed to get a hold of me, I did not have a cell phone. They would page you, and then you'd have a number come up on that, and then you'd have to carry a bunch of quarters around to go to a payphone and then call into your post-production supervisor or whatever and find out what they needed. But eventually, in the late 90s, I got this Nokia phone. I don't know if I thought I had notes on it, but maybe I don't. Anyway, in any event, yeah, here it is. That was 1999. So that was my first phone. Of course, like everybody else, the iPhone didn't come along until 2006 or 7. So at that point, I would have been 30, 31 years old. Many of you would have either just been born or were very close to being born around the time the iPhone came along. This is my first computer. This actually is a Commodore 64. I got my first home computer, when I was in high school. I didn't exactly grow up in a puddle of money, but my parents were kind enough to get me a home computer in high school, and that looks pretty basic, right? Floppy disks was the memory on that thing was nothing. The speed on that thing was nothing. And well, suffices to say, I still thought it was the coolest thing that I'd ever seen because I had no idea what was coming around in the future. So something to consider when you guys get a piece of technology. How will that change in your lifetime? Well, it certainly changed dramatically in mine. There's my first video game. You might recognize this. This is called Pong. And basically, when we get into video games, I'll talk about that history. But I first got this game when I was about 10 years old. So you could say, by and large, I was kind of, video games came along very, very early for me. So I'm part of the video game generation. I guess you would consider me the first. But when we get into video games, I'll explain that. But that's Pong, and that is pretty funny when I show that. By the way, I have one other picture to show you. That is a rotary phone. Okay. Now, obviously, we are all used to. Where's my phone? Here it is. Under my sweatshirt over here. That's what we're used to, right? The iPhone. Well, back in the day, it was a rotary phone. And it would be too difficult virtually here to explain how that works. Just suffices to say that I finally started to see the ones where you could actually do the push buttons. That came along probably middle part of elementary to latter part of elementary school. So this rotary phone was very much in play when I was younger. And it's interesting because when I was out at the Rose Bowl at some kind of flea market a few years ago, somebody was selling those things as like antiques, and it's just funny because like it was, I wish I had just saved a couple of mine. They would have made a little bit of money. So anyway, but we're talking about the digital environment today, right? That's what chapter 2 is kind of about. It's all about the internet and social media. So let's get to it. So basically, you, I, your family, your friends, just about everybody on planet Earth, minus maybe the farmers in Afghanistan and the deep, deep throes of North Korea where everything's blocked, understand what the internet is, right? Which is it's a vast network of fiber optic lines, wireless connections, and satellite systems that link digital devices to enormous data centers around the world. So you guys were born into the internet, believe it or not. I'm going to go through the history of it. It did not come along for me until halfway up the ladder for me, but it is an absolutely critical component of life today, right? And in 2023, almost 5.3 billion people were internet users. Now, there's only like 7 billion on the planet. So I'm asking myself, what are the other 1.7 doing? But hey, anything that has 5.3 billion consumers tied to it is a significant piece of technology, correct? Anyway, smaller and wealthier countries like Norway and Saudi Arabia have the highest rates of internet access. In fact, one of the things that we're going to be landing the plane later in this lecture on is kind of who's connected and who's not. But suffice it to say, Norway and Saudi Arabia have the highest rates. And then China and India are home to the highest number of total internet users. That's obvious because of population, right? China has a tremendous amount of people, 4 times as much as we have here in the US. And so therefore, it would make sense that if you've got more than 1 billion people as a country, you're going to have a lot more internet users than, say, the US, which only has, 325 million, something like that. So anyway, another thing that is associated with the internet is what's called the byte. You've heard of it, BYTE, not byte as in bite a hamburger, which is a basic unit to measure digital information. And the internet and digital communication competed with and absorbed previous technologies and industries. We talked a lot about that in chapter 1. How about some numbers here? I just think you'd find these interesting before we kind of jump into a little bit of history. Did you know that users check their smartphone up to 80 times daily? And I really think that's actually a low number because if you do the math, let's say that we're up 16 hours a day, give or take. That means that we're really only checking our phone, 5 or 6 times? See, I guess that's an average. I can tell you that I check my phone a whole lot more. And I'm sure you do the same. But anyway, still 80 times daily is pretty impressive. Our average screen time per day is almost 5.5 hours. It's actually almost double that for teens. And we spend 2.5 hours a day on social media, which is a lot, right? A lot. Top 10% touch their phones up to 5,427 times per day. So that users checking their smartphone up to 80 times daily really crystallizes when you realize that the top 10% of the population touch their phones nearly 5,400 times a day. And there's a lot of people, by the way, on the other side that don't really do much with their phones. You may know some folks like that. Maybe folks that are, obviously really young, like babies or under the age of 6, or anyone over the age of like 75 or 80 is probably not going to be using the phone like everyone in between. 89% of people, 13%. Sorry, I skipped over a couple things here. Currently, almost 300 million smartphone users in the U.S. That's pretty staggering considering that what is the population? About 320, 330. So that means that Generally speaking, about 90% of the population has a smartphone. 13% of millennials spend over 12 hours a day on phones. 89% of people reported using their phone during a meal with friends or family. So remember, we talked about how it's culturally shifted how we kind of deal with each other. And there's a great stat to really kind of hammer it home that when you're sitting at dinner, supposedly having a conversation with friends or family, and 90% of you are using your phone during that meal, that's not really great, right? Not saying that I'm not guilty, because I am, but it's something to reflect upon. And on average, just so you know, it takes about 23 minutes for someone to get back on task after being interrupted by a notification on their phone. 23 minutes. So it's very much a time waster. How about time it took to reach 50 million users? Okay. Now we're going to talk a lot about some of these different aspects, but radio, for example, took 38 years. So radio invented early 1920s, late 19 teens. And it took, essentially until almost 1960, mid 50s to reach 50 million users. Television, like I said, 13 years. In fact, that number was even greater. Internet was 4 years, and look, Facebook 3.5 years. So really puts into perspective how powerful the internet is. All right, well, you can't talk the internet without a little bit of history. And I want you to be familiar with some things, because you will see a quiz, midterm, final exam on some of this stuff. Anyway, let's talk about something called ARPANET. So to understand where the internet started, it actually started with something called ARPANET, which was created by the U.S. Department of Defense to enable researchers to pool computing power. Now, understand that this is in the mid to late 60s, and this was during the height of the Cold War. And this is not a history class, I understand that, but understand that in the mid to late 60s, the U.S., and it's still true today in 2026, but the U.S. and the Soviet Union, this is not Russia, this was actually the Soviet Union, had missiles pointed at each other. And the threat of nuclear war was always looming. And it's something I grew up with, and it wasn't fun. But there were people much smarter than me, and, that were saying, what if, we have a nuclear war? What would happen to the flow of communication? What would happen to if our information, if it was just in one area? And so there was a motivation to decentralize all of the information and vital information that this country was kind of sitting on. And so therefore, why not create a system where you could disperse that information all over the place? And so if you hit one thing here, it didn't necessarily mean that it disappeared. So that was one goal, right? Another goal was to connect research institutions and share computer resources, right? This was the time where this was prior to microprocessors coming out. So computers were very large, and didn't have a lot of storage space. And so they were constantly trying to find ways to pool resources, right? So they used what was called packet switching, which was breaking data into small packets. And so you had researchers, very smart guys, start looking into how to experiment with solving these problems. And in late October in 1969, you had the first ARPANET link between the UCLA and Stanford established. And actually, there were other schools too. UCSB, I learned recently, where my kids go to school. UCSB was involved in this. And so you had what was called ARPANET, a link between researchers between UCLA and Stanford. And the first message was actually login, but the system crashed after just 2 letters. So you can see that there was a lot of work to be done. ARPANET eventually grew to include universities, labs, and research centers, and email as part of this kind of expansion was created in 1971, and it quickly became the most popular application. The idea that you could actually swap instant messaging between computers, that was something that couldn't be done prior to the quote-unquote ARPANET being created. The invention in the 1970s of microprocessors helped computers become more affordable and smaller. Just as if you want to look at something interesting, I think it's a Harvard Mark IV, which was a computer in the late 50s, was basically the size of like a 2-story building. And once microprocessors came along with transistors, you had the idea of a home computer. So that's why, for example, Apple first started its computers in like 1975 or 76, and that wasn't an accident. That was because of microprocessors. Also, fiber optic cable was created in the 70s, or really in the 80s. If you know, that was probably a 1980s creation. But it increased the amount of data networks could handle at increased speeds. So you could have computers like swapping information on an instant basis in a much larger way. Tim Berners-Lee, that's a name that you might want to be familiar with. He created HTML, or the World Wide Web, WWW. So no, it was a big joke running around right after the internet was created. Al Gore, a former Democratic candidate for president, former senator from Tennessee, was supposedly running around claiming he had created the internet. That is not true. Tim Berners-Lee is the actual guy in a particles lab in Switzerland that actually created the what you would say the skeleton, if you will, the bones for the internet as we know it. And that HTML was a language that made it easier for computers to talk, locate, and link files. And so anyone that's a computer nerd that's watching this lecture is probably like, oh man, you're really oversimplifying it, but doing my best. All right. So real quickly, the next thing you had to figure out to become internet ready was the idea of being able to search, right? To browse. And it allowed users to navigate the web. So when we were talking about practical, entrepreneurial stage, et cetera, you have an idea, then you figure out how does it become marketable. Well, in order to do this for the internet, you had to make it easy enough so that people could log on to something and start to be able to browse and not have to understand all sorts of really complicated computer code. And so basically, browsers gave mass audiences greater access to online information. There's some of your early ones: Mosaic, Netscape, Internet Explorer was an early one. Obviously, we know of Google Chrome, Safari, Firefox, more modern forms of it. But just think about it. Anytime you want to get on the internet, you have to click on that little Chrome symbol or that, Internet Explorer symbol or Firefox, etc. Safari, I guess Internet Explorer has kind of gone away, the dinosaur, but Safari, Firefox, and Google are really the most popular ones now. You also have to have someone that can help you connect, right? Through the phone company, through your telecommunications company, and that would be an internet service provider. And so that connects users to their proprietary web system. And so basically, my first company that I went through was AOL, which introduced modems in 1985, email in 1993, and basically you would essentially plug a cable from your computer into the wall, like a phone cable, and you'd hit a button on your computer and it would tweet, and you'd find a number to connect to, or you'd find a number and then you'd see the tweet. And that was AOL connecting you to a very basic model of the internet. And if you had invested a little bit of money in AOL by 2000, you would have been making a lot of money. But of course, AOL eventually kind of, ceded ground to other companies that came along since, right? We also have something called broadband, which is high-speed internet. That replaced, slow-speed internet after the turn of the century. And I just, again, go back to the Wayback Machine, or you can probably YouTube something, say what did computers look like back in the 90s. Well, this is what they kind of looked like right here, right? This is what basically, if you went to Yahoo in like the mid to late 90s, it was just text-based, right? There wasn't video, there wasn't interactivity of it now. And that's all because as the system has gotten faster with broadband and high-speed internet, we can now watch live programming, we can watch videos, listen to music, all that stuff. Impossible to do 30 years ago. Obviously now with the advent of broadband, very much possible. All right. Now, we also had what are called search engines, right? Which is not just you have to have a browser to get onto the internet, but once you get on the internet, how do you find what you're looking for? And of course, the first was Yahoo. And then, of course, Google came along in 1998 right, which became a major success. And both of these things were all about algorithms. Essentially, Google, kind of tracked what you were looking for and would oftentimes feed you information that would help you based on some of your recent search history. And of course, companies love that because companies, if you were looking, for example, a good coffee cup or maybe a good coffee maker, you would type in coffee maker. And of course, there were companies that competed to obviously be at the very top of the search list for a new coffee maker. That's still true today. Because of broadband and high-speed internet, the internet went from basically Web 1.0 to Web 2.0. And of course, unlocking that history essentially took us from basically the internet being sort of this place where you would just go sort of read, what's called read only. You could also do a read write system with broadband because now it's fast enough where you can interact with it, right? And so Web 2.0, the internet becomes interactive. Websites, you can go to websites where users can read information, contribute digital content, a la YouTube, of course, and directly engage with other users. And of course, that certainly opened the door for social media, right? Because that's what we do now. We are constantly creating and interconnecting with people. And that was very, very difficult to do up until Web 2.0. Like you could go into, in the late 90s on AOL, you could get into a chat with somebody, but that it was very, very basic. You were just basically chatting sentences. It's almost like a text. It's almost like you could do text messaging, but without any of the images or videos or whatever that we do now. That's kind of how sort of the internet sort of worked up until Web 2.0. In any event, social media platforms have exploited the capabilities of Web 2.0. Users create detailed profiles, sites feed users information tailored to their interests, and of course, the almighty algorithm. We're not only getting fed and stuff tailored to our interests, but again, we don't have to even get out of our bubble because it just continually feeds us what we want to hear or see. Speaking of social media, we start to see what's called the introduction of content communities. Obviously, YouTube came along, might have the year wrong here, but I think around 2005. Somewhere in that neighborhood. And eventually Google bought YouTube. And out there is somewhere, the first original YouTube video. And of course, YouTube was just the beginning. Of course, there were obviously websites that you could go to as well, but YouTube was really the first content sharing, really the first major content sharing site that just was truly unique. And now, of course, the world can't live without it. In fact, 5 billion videos are viewed a day on YouTube. And it's the best example of a many-to-many ethic of social media. And it's an integral part of our social media experience. And now, of course, since then, we have seen the creation of Facebook. We've seen the creation of Twitter. We've seen the creation of TikTok, Snapchat. Prior to TikTok, it was Vine. If you remember the short-lived experience of Vine, Periscope. I don't know if anyone remembers Periscope out there, but there's been a number of different social media platforms. But now, of course, really the biggies are Facebook, Instagram. Facebook's the biggest, of course, even though a lot of your generation's not on Facebook. Facebook is still kind of the industry leader. Mark Zuckerberg's company, Meta, and of course, Meta, I should say, owns not just Facebook, but WhatsApp and, of course, Instagram. And then, of course, we'll talk about Elon Musk here in a bit with X/Twitter. Anyway, all-time videos. I thought this would be kind of fun. This is actually a year old. I should have updated this, but forgive me. But in any event, you can see how many billions of views certain videos have. I can't really say that I've watched Baby Shark Dance, but it has 15.4 billion views as of a year ago. So, in fact, never mind. I won't waste your time, but feel free to get on YouTube and see what the top ones are now. By the way, 88% of people between the ages of 18 and 29 use social media. 90% of Instagram users are under the age of 35. So anyone that says, well, I'm not on social media that much, or I don't use social media, again, it falls under the category of YouTube, Facebook, X, Snapchat, Twitter, TikTok, whatever. I'm probably forgetting one, but any one of those platforms is kind of considered social media. Average person spends, again, 2.5 hours per day on social media. 45%, by the way, people say social media makes them feel overwhelmed. Gosh, I don't know. I think the number is going even higher. It's been an interesting start to the year in terms of just stuff that's happening on social media with stuff that's happening on planet Earth right now. And I don't know if you're feeling any fatigue, but I sure am. 70% of people say they would feel lost without social media. It's kind of funny, right? People are like, ah, God, I really don't want to spend more time on social media because it's so depressing. But then on the flip side, it's like, well, if I, for example, if I'm like, no, I'm not going to go on Twitter this month, right? Well, then you feel like if you don't go on Twitter, you feel like you're kind of lost. So it's really kind of a love-hate relationship, right? Brazil, by the way, has one of the highest rates of social media addiction, 3.8 hours per day on all platforms. And then here, 7 out of 10 people feel social media is important for finding news and information. Good and bad all at the same time. Good from the standpoint that obviously we have the opportunity to be more informed at just our fingertips. Trust me, from someone who had to do this like 30 or 40 years ago when it came to media, it was very difficult to feel comprehensively informed. Now, of course, we can be, but be careful because it's so unverified and unchecked and out of context, and it can be, stories can be shared that are completely false, right? And then that becomes the story, that becomes the quote unquote narrative. So yeah, you do your due diligence when you're trying to find out whatever the story is about. Make sure that you're not just getting part of it. All right. Is social media dangerous or harmful? Well, I clearly think, I don't think I'm being controversial saying this because I'm backed by research and numbers and all sorts of things, but social media is addicting, right? Your brain functions similar to online gaming. When we are on social media, we are triggering things, chemical reactions in our brain, same aspects of our brain that oftentimes are like when we get into online gaming. Now, I'm not going to completely just poop on social media. There's going to be a positive side to it here as well. But I want to bring you sort of the dysfunctional side, if you will, first of all. First off, there's also self-image issues, right? We create these ideas of ourselves, or we try to live up to ideas of others that are presented on, or images that are presented on social media that sometimes are just not like based in reality, but because we see them, we assume they are, right? Some college age girls who use Facebook link self-worth to their looks. There's bullying and cyberbullying, right? 1 out of 4 teens say they've been bullied. 43% of those online, right? Social media contributes to creating an online filter, right? Spaces where we are exposed only to ideas that match our own beliefs. Remember that term, selective exposure? That is true here. Social media amplifies confirmation bias. It favors information that conforms to our pre-existing beliefs over information that challenges them. Again, staying in our bubble, right? We view the world a certain way, and we don't necessarily social media feeds that. So you see that in politics for sure, for absolutely 100%. People believe politically the way they believe, and I think a lot of it is because they're finding like-minded individuals who they constantly are just feeding off each other. I can't tell you how many times, I don't care what the story is, but I will see someone post something on Facebook, and it's literally an echo chamber. And I think to myself, maybe there's probably an alternative point of view here that might be worth throwing in there. But then if you do that, then it's like cannons on a hill. So I don't know. I don't think it's necessarily healthy for us. Social media has become so prominent in our culture that many people experience what's called FOMO. Not a term that is unfamiliar to you, But I thought what I would do here is stop sharing and um, show you kind of a good example of what FOMO is. So give me a second and let me share my other screen here. And we're going to talk about FOMO. Here we go.
Picture this. You log into social media and you see this picture of some friends at a party. Scroll down and here's a video of a friend cliff diving in Cancun. A number of friends are talking about Garden Cop and you haven't seen it yet. And now you start feeling something called FOMO, or fear of missing out. FOMO is the anxiety we experience when we feel there's something exciting happening elsewhere and we're not a part of it. It's been around for a long time, but these days it's triggered mostly by posts on social media. Social media gives us instant access to the activity of our friends. That's what it's there for. And this can be a good thing, but it also makes it all too easy for us to compare our lives to theirs. This can lead us to second-guessing our decisions and feeling insecure in general. It can even get to the point when there's a looming sense of FOMO even when we're not online. So how do we kick this FOMO? An answer that might quickly spring to mind is to simply quit social media. But that's not practical for a lot of people. Instead of quitting, you can try limiting your time on it or even just taking a few days off. This can give you a chance to focus on what's important in your life and enjoy the things that you are doing without comparing them to others. The lives of our friends do sometimes look pretty exciting online, but let's put some quotation marks around the word lives. Their social media activity isn't their actual life per se. It's more of a highlight reel of exciting things they've posted to contribute to their online identity. It's easy to see these highlights and think, my life just isn't as exciting as theirs. But what we're usually not seeing is what's going on behind the scenes, the negative things or the boring routine of their day-to-day lives. They may post something awesome, but in the grand scheme of things, it's just a short snippet of their day. The odds are, when they're not out doing these awesome things, they probably experience just as much FOMO as you do.
So that's FOMO. And I think take a second to reflect when you've been online and you've seen friends of yours, family members, I don't know, acquaintances, and they're posting some cool stuff. I mean, I'll be honest, I got a little FOMO recently when a good friend of mine, he and his wife and kids went skiing up in Canada. I've never skied in Canada before. In fact, I didn't go anywhere this break. I just didn't have time and didn't want to spend the money. And so when I saw them on this like Canadian like ski adventure, yeah, I mean, sure, you know, would love to be there, but that's kind of FOMO, right? And not to say that it's, I mean, not to say that you know, just stop like looking at what people are doing altogether, but just realize that sometimes that there are things that will make you feel like you're left out. Or the other side of it is people constantly posting about how great their life is when you're only seeing a smidge of what they're doing on a daily basis, and they're painting a much more positive brush over something that maybe is not so positive. So just be aware that social media has a tendency to help to kind of have us experience what's called FOMO. I also want to play this next video for you without having to share the screen again. And it's also an image thing, right? In fact, I was going to say that basically people are so tethered to social media that sometimes I think that it creates this kind of unhealthy relationship. And so there's someone called Jonathan Haidt, who is a psychologist who really has spent a lot of his time writing and speaking about social media. And it's kind of like, especially its effect on younger women and how it's really kind of changed. And part of it's related to FOMO. So, and anyone, let me play this for you. I think this was he appeared on Real Time with Bill Maher. If you don't know who Bill Maher is, he's a guy that's on HBO. Usually has a show on Friday nights and usually brings in a bunch of different people. Sometimes it's political. And in fact, a lot of it's political in nature. but sometimes they do talk about things that sort of waffle between culture and politics. So anyway, here is Jonathan Haidt.
Why is it that when you look at the mental health stats, if you look at rates of depression, anxiety, self-harm, and suicide, they're pretty flat in the early 2000s. And then right at 2012, for girls, it goes way, way up. It goes up for boys too, but not as much. Something happened right around 2012. Well, let's see. The first front-facing camera comes out, the iPhone 4 in 2010. Instagram is founded. Everyone goes on Instagram in 2012. So at least the social media fits the bill. But what I think people really need to understand is it's not just kids going on social media. It's the complete rewiring of childhood so that kids used to be out having experiences. That's what you need to grow up. That's what you need to wire your brain up. And then they hit puberty, which is actually a period of heightened brain plasticity. Our brains are really open to experience when we're 0 to 2, and then it's a little less. And then right around age 11 or 12, the brain is almost looking for more input from the environment. And that's exactly the age at which we say to girls, here you go, why don't you hook your brain up to a fire hose of garbage, and then we'll see how you are on the other side. So yes, we're really, what was your word, fucked up?
Fucked up. Fucking the kids' brains up.
So your kids are what, 8 and 9?
8 and 9, yeah.
Okay, so they're still in elementary school.
Yeah.
When they go to middle school, my kids go to New York City public schools. As soon as they hit 6th grade, they say, Dad, everybody is on Instagram. Can I have an Instagram account? We're all faced with this trap. No parent wants their kids on Instagram, but we're all faced with this trap because the other kids are on. We don't want our kids to be excluded because that is where things are happening. So this is what's called in social science a collective action problem. Each one of us might even be even worse off if we take our kid off and everyone else is on, but we would all be better off if everything was off. So what we need to do as a starting move, this is something we can all do, get the phones and social media the hell out of middle school. Let's just protect middle school. Okay. And so if you're watching this at home, talk to the principal of your parents' middle school and say, can you help us? Because believe me, I've spoken at middle schools, they hate this too. So as a starting move, just have the norm be no phones in school. When you come to school, put them in a phone locker or a yonder pouch. The kids must not have access to their phones in school. Usually the policy is, well, we don't let them take them out. Like, yeah, tell heroin addicts, you can just leave it in your pocket. Don't shoot up. Just leave it in your pocket all day. So we have to get it out of middle school, and we also have to keep the kids off of social media until at least high school. I think the age needs to be 16 after the brain is mostly developed.
So there's Jonathan Haidt making some very interesting comments, and I was going to say that. Let me get back up on our PowerPoint here. I was going to say that I think him saying obviously implying how addictive social media can be, how addictive phones can be, that to really kind of keep them out of the hands of folks under the age of 16. Reflect on that, because you've been there, right? Do you think that that's a good idea? Do you think it's a practical idea? And of course, a lot of school districts now are actually, a lot of K through 12s are passing policies where the kids don't have the phones in the classrooms. And so this has always been an active discussion when I've been doing this in person. And obviously I know you're just sitting behind a computer monitor here, just kind of listening to me one-on-one, but reflect on that, because I think, part of me, I like the idea of not having, of keeping phones out of kids' hands to a certain age, but I just don't know how practical that is. And maybe you feel the same way, maybe you don't, but feel free to email me or, send me a note if you think I'm off base here. All right. Well, let's talk about social media and censorship. A 2021 national survey of 2,000 Americans found that 3/4 of Americans don't trust social media companies to make fair content moderation decisions. So, in other words, especially when it comes to social media, and we're talking, for example, Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. Facebook and Twitter probably be the two most on this one. That basically most Americans don't trust that social media companies are making fair content moderation decisions, right? 81% of Republicans think Facebook and Twitter's Trump ban, for example, violated the First Amendment. So right after January 6th, if you remember, one of the things that happened was that Twitter, which was then owned, gosh, why am I forgetting his name? Jack Dorsey, I think that's his name, was owned by Jack Dorsey, basically took Trump off Twitter, and Mark Zuckerberg deplatformed Trump off Facebook because they were obviously worried that his constant tweets, his constant messaging on Facebook was revolutionary in nature, if you will, right? That might have led to January 6th. And of course, now, Trump is back on Twitter because he obviously has a much better relationship with Elon Musk. That doesn't necessarily mean that Trump's, and he also bought his own social media company, created his own called Truth Social, right? Which he then takes and sometimes posts on his Twitter account. But anyway, it's crazy what's happened, how far we've come in like 4 years from that moment, or 5 years. Anyway, a majority of Democrats, nearly 70%, would rather curb the spread of information, even though that means at times censoring the truth. But here's the problem. We talk about the idea of misinformation, disinformation, right? But we can't agree what that is. In many cases, sometimes that's not necessarily true. So I'll give you an example. Right after COVID, Rand Paul, who's a congressman from Kentucky, a senator from Kentucky, was taken off of YouTube because he said that cloth masks were not effective in transmitting or preventing the transmission of COVID. And he was deplatformed for it, when in fact it was actually true. That if you wear a cloth mask into a room, it's not going to necessarily protect you or protect the person, from the spread of COVID. That was one of many examples, right? So what is quote unquote false information? No one can seemingly agree or disagree on that. And that's why social media has become such an issue. In fact, there's Senator Rand Paul suspended for 7 days off YouTube. Twitter and Facebook banned the New York Post, if you remember, look this up, in October of 2020, right before the Trump-Biden election. Basically, the New York Post had reported that Biden's son, Hunter Biden, had left a laptop at a Delaware computer repair shop. And basically the FBI, lying at the time, by the way, said, oh, that didn't exist. The New York Post shouldn't be reporting that, shouldn't be reporting false information. And so Twitter and Facebook both took the New York Post story down, basically deplatformed the New York Post, deplatformed anybody that tried to share the story. And as you know, it turned out to be a completely legitimately true story. And there's a belief out there that might have been a deciding factor in the 2020 election. Not my opinion, just that's what's been reported. Elon Musk, in fact, purchased Twitter in October of 2023 in many ways because of that. He spent a couple of years basically because he felt like there were certain groups of people that were getting deplatformed off of Twitter, particularly conservatives. And so Elon Musk bought Twitter and then changed it to X for $44 billion and currently still owns it. And I'll let you kind of draw your own conclusions about that story. Musk releases internal Twitter documents once he bought the company, showing specific discussion and emails between Twitter employees about their content moderation decisions. And there was, at least in Musk's view of what he released, that there was definitely some folks at Twitter that were trying to basically, define misinformation or disinformation. And in a lot of cases, they were saying conservatives were pushing it. And so they were deplatforming conservatives. And so that led to obviously Twitter becoming a huge, huge media property. Social media has also changed the way we consume, relate to, and even produce media, the way we communicate with others. So it's not just censorship. It's not just FOMO. It's not just image issues. On the positive side, there's been plenty of examples out there where social media has been used as a weapon of good, weapon of good. That doesn't make sense. How about a tool of good? That's better, right? And basically, it's also where our thoughts and opinions can be shared. It's an outlet, right? We can write or update an encyclopedic entry like Wikipedia, for example. You can post a video and create and explore virtual worlds. Like we can, share videos with each other, and things get shown that we don't necessarily get to experience. And I think that's what makes social media kind of fun. It's also a tool for democracy and for undermining repressive regimes. And I think the greatest examples, and I'm going to show you a couple of these on video here in just a second. But the first one was the Arab Spring. That was a wave of protests and uprisings that began in late 2010. This was right around the time, by the way, that YouTube had started becoming popular. I think Twitter came along around 2010, if I'm not mistaken. Facebook was only a couple of years old at this point. But anyway, it was a wave of protests and uprising that began in late 2010 across the Middle East and North Africa, sparked by public anger over authoritarians' rule, corruption, unemployment, and high living costs. It started in Tunisia after a street vendor self-immolation and quickly spread to countries like Egypt, Libya, Syria, Yemen, and Bahrain. The outcomes varied widely. Tunisia moved toward more democratic reforms. Egypt briefly overthrew its president before returning to military rule. Libya, Syria, and Yemen descended into prolonged conflict or civil war. And overall, the Arab Spring raised hopes for political reform, but largely resulted in instability, repression, or conflict rather than lasting democracy. Now, social media played a key role in that Arab Spring by helping people organize, communicate, and share information outside state-controlled media. Platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube were used to coordinate protests, spread details about times and locations, and quickly mobilize large crowds. They also allowed activists to document police brutality and government crackdown, sharing videos and firsthand accounts that drew international attention and countered official narratives. While social media didn't cause the uprisings, it accelerated their spread, helping connect activists across borders and made it harder for government to fully control information, at least in the early stages. Another example was Black Lives Matter. Let me share that video with you real quick. This is kind of an older video, but relates to how Black Lives Matter. Let me see. Is it this here? Yeah, this comes from ABC News Australia. Here you go.
This is the face of a new grassroots movement. The young multiracial group didn't exist 2 weeks ago. Now it has tens of thousands of online followers.
I couldn't sit by and let another group do it, or wait for another group to do it, or wait for anybody else to come and save us.
Zeus X is one of 7 founders of Freedom Fighters DC.
We're basically begging our government to treat us like human beings, and that's not what we want for our next generation. So it ends here.
Using social media, they galvanized the movement and got boots on the ground within 24 hours.
I can draw attention to a cause fairly quickly, and I think that has allowed us to unite in a way that hasn't been done in a civil rights protest before.
They call social media a tool of justice because it has the power to give a voice to the unheard and the discriminated.
Something about seeing a man die, on national television, and just seeing all 8 minutes and 46 seconds, I think that it was, it's just horrifying. And it just felt like enough is enough.
These young medics are among more than 50 to volunteer first aid support.
I do have white privilege, and it's how can I use that privilege to make good change?
George Floyd's death has thrust racial injustice to the center of the presidential race. Gen Zers and millennials make up close to 40% of eligible voters. The question is whether the anger lasts long enough to get them to the ballot box in November.
Over the past 2 weeks, support for the Black Lives Matter movement has jumped as much as it did in the past 2 years. More than half of Americans now back the cause. This younger generation largely driving the change. Catherine Diss, ABC News, Washington.
All right, so that was obviously Black Lives Matter, a social movement that began in 2013 to protest police brutality, systemic racism, and racial injustice. And it gained global prominence after high-profile police killings, including Michael Brown in 2014, George Floyd in 2020. And of course, social media was central to BLM's growth. The hashtag Black Lives Matter helped spread awareness, organize protests, and share real-time videos of police encounters that challenged official accounts. Platforms like Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok amplified personal stories, mobilized millions quickly, and turned local incidents into national and international movements. Now, the last one, of course, I'm not going to go back to the screen, but I will just play the video, is, of course, Occupy Wall Street. A lot of people don't remember this, but this was actually a protest movement began in 2011 in New York City, opposing economic inequality, corporate influence in politics, and the power of the 1%. So here is Occupy Wall Street.
Protests started in mid-September when some 1,000 people marched through New York's financial district, demonstrating against what they termed corporate greed and growing income inequality in the United States. Some of the protesters stayed overnight in a small private park. More than a month later, the demonstrators have formed a thriving community, and the park has become a base from which they conduct protests and acts of civil disobedience. Activist Alexa O'Brien was one of the original organizers.
It was really just a personal impulsive action. I didn't realize that it was going to get 1,000 followers in a week. So at that point, I knew that there was a responsibility that we had to create a space for Americans to voice their grievance against government.
Fueled by social media networks, the movement took off. While it started symbolically in the backyard of the world's most powerful bankers on Wall Street, it has now spread to more than 100 cities across the US, Europe, and Asia. O'Brien credits the power of online networking for this success.
Occupy Wall Street was made by the internet. I mean, it was a group of activists, but it was basically expanded and really, I don't know, it was like a shot of, adrenaline through it. And the reason why you see so many different voices here, it really is a physical manifestation of the internet, which is a civic space as well.
While the internet has helped spread the concerns of Occupy Wall Street, social networking is also used to expose alleged misdeeds by police.
In the age of social media, you cannot mistreat people. You cannot abuse them because your face will be all over Twitter.
Jesse LaGreca is a testament to the power of social media.
And you guys kind of had a big part in it, so I'm glad to see you coming around.
He was featured berating a Fox News producer in a video that went viral online, with more than 100,000 views on YouTube.
That's exactly why the mainstream media hasn't figured this out yet.
LaGreca says social media allows the movement to circumvent traditional media.
They're so far behind the curve now, they're just obsolete. Everybody has YouTube, everybody has Twitter, everybody has Facebook.
The protesters have inspired comparisons with the so-called Arab Spring, the recent social upheavals in the Arab world. But those involved say the comparison only goes so far.
Participating in the protest here is the same as participating in protests in many other countries, I believe, because you're not, yes, you can be arrested, but you are not marching with the fear that the police will come and hit you on the top of your head with a baton or attack you with live ammunition like it's been happening in other countries, especially in the Middle East.
Yet, while similarities between the two movements might be limited, there are some common themes.
It's not like the people in Egypt needed the Egyptian media to get their message out. They were doing it fine on their own. So we're kind of copying the same model.
Despite its recent growth, the movement's goals are muddled, and it has intentionally avoided naming a leader. With the movement expanding and spreading internationally, the discontent with the status quo may be a message that is hard to ignore. Arash Zadeh, VOA News.
So that was another example of social media and democracy. Social media, I should say, played a crucial role by helping organizers mobilize supporters, coordinate encampments, share live streams, photos, and messages that bypass traditional media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and Tumblr, which amplified the movement's message and turned local protests into a national conversation. Eventually, a lot of these encampments were eventually taken down by local governments, local authorities, but that was certainly part of that history. So in any event, let's get back to the PowerPoint here. before we move into modern day, a couple of things. Basically, you don't see these types of movements though in areas that don't have free speech. China, absolutely not. China has I want to say nearly 30,000 employees that monitor or even block web pages, blogs, chat rooms, emails, and social media that might get the government, put the government sort of in on its back foot. And of course, North Korea, which is probably the most repressive regime on the face of planet Earth, has around 30 websites, and that's it. And it's all government controlled. So, you know, as much as we talk about things that are crazy here in the U.S. and how the news can be, you know, somewhat depressing from time to time, be very happy that we have the First Amendment, which I know some people have talked recently about challenging. I'm not amongst one of those. I think the First Amendment is important. And I certainly think that if you didn't have the First Amendment, you wouldn't have the history that we have with social media and democracy. Just my humble opinion. All right, today's Web 3.0, characterized by three interrelated developments. We have the semantic web, which is new website structures allowed computers to examine web pages and databases and provide solutions to people's needs. I think the easiest one to think about it in that case is Netflix, for example. Netflix like literally tracks what you watch and works with you in a sense to continue to feed you things that you want to watch. So, you know, you'll notice that if like, I will say this is kind of funny. My wife watches Korean dramas. I don't know where she got started on that, but she loves those things. And if you look at her, like her Netflix page versus my Netflix page, her Netflix page has got all sorts of romantic comedies and it's Korean, it's international in nature. You look at mine because I like to watch, you know, more, I guess, would be newsy, sort of hardcore type of dramas. I get more of that, you know, kind of that flavor. Obviously, there's something called the Internet of Things, which integrates the internet in almost every part of our environment. So, you know, smart refrigerators, smartphones, smart televisions, you know, gosh, our vacuums, our, you know, our home security systems, right? All of that is encompassing around the internet. And I've always said that you truly want to make America, society completely come to a standstill, just figure out how to break the internet for a couple of days and see what happens. It would not be good. Artificial intelligence, AI, we talked a lot about that in chapter 1, machine learning algorithms that can teach themselves how to improve their performance. You know, this idea that, you know, literally we have things in the ether where it can learn and it can learn for you, right? So if you're typing, say, a prompt into ChatGPT or GPT, it will actually coach you into trying to get smarter and smarter, or you can coach that program into becoming smarter. So, for example, I've seen my associate from across the hall, Austin Dave, when he's trying to basically develop, or he's trying to work on, you know, a new system for our television production, he often will start to work with AI to just, you know, develop better signal flow, for example. I think that's pretty cool. All right. Media consumption is mobile and flexible. We don't miss out on our content, right? That's our expectation now. When, you know, if we're watching either our show, we're watching news, we're connected, we just assume that we're connected. And when we don't, we kind of freak about it, right? We demand immediate access in multiple formats. You know, so again, you know, I'm a Bronco fan, right? So if I want to watch Bronco stuff, I'm not just expecting to see the Broncos play on television. You know, I'm watching great plays on YouTube. I'm listening to a Bronco podcast. You know, there's lots of different ways that you can consume media now. It's changed the way media companies do business, right? Websites are now small screen centric, and many of them are now doing this vertical storytelling, for example, right? So, you know, you have certain things that are entertaining, and now we're getting it in shorter clips, vertical storytelling, like in Instagram Reels, right? Or Facebook Reels or YouTube Reels, right? Everything is geared around this guy. And it's also tougher for media companies to measure live audiences. So one thing we'll talk about when we get to television is you know, there were only 3 networks back in the early 1970s that had 90% of the audience. So you could literally measure how many people were watching a particular show on a given night. Well, of course, you know, I might watch a show that's on, what's a good example of this? Oh, I was watching a show that take Breaking Bad. Some of you might watch Breaking Bad, might start watching it after I mention it. That show was on the air on cable back in like 2008, 2009. Breaking Bad, not Better Call Saul. That was more recent. But there's like, so there you go. Then we have a whole new group of people that watch that. But you can't measure it live, because when it was on live, a lot of people would watch it later on, you know, streaming content or streaming media like Netflix or whatever. So anyway, it's tough for media companies to measure live audiences these days. Today's web, okay, Google, Amazon, Meta, Facebook, obviously, Instagram, they participate in what's called surveillance capitalism, making money by controlling users' personal data. I don't know if you realize how much stuff is sold behind the curtain, if you will, but our information is constantly being sold from one web presence to another. I have one of my stepbrothers works in this area, and he came in a few years ago and talked about just how much stuff is sold behind the scenes. And that's a lot of that is because Google makes money off of users. Amazon makes money off of users. Meta makes money off of what we are constantly searching for or talking about, right? They use things called data mining, which is tracking search histories, locations, browser settings, other user information that just, we leave a digital trail, right? That's what we do on a daily basis. And, you know, unless you're someone that like is continually trying to create, you know, clean up your digital trail, the fact is you have a digital trail, and it's, you know, it's might as well be a bright orange path that goes, you know, that you've walked from, that everyone can see where you've been, right? We use cookies, computer files that automatically collect and transfer information between a website and user's browser. That's why when you go on like a website, it says, you know, in order to surf this, you have to accept cookies. Well, it's because it's tracking what your computer, the internet is tracking, companies are tracking what you're searching for. It's why when you go into a store and you get a coupon after you've been up at the cash register, and those coupons are for stuff you've bought before in the past, it's because they track you, right? And of course, we all have an IP address, the unique number that every device uses when communicating on the internet, whether it be your phone, a computer, your iPad, all has what's called an IP address, and it's how we get tracked as well. Social media platforms use addictive design principles to maximize user engagement. Infinite scroll, like buttons, continually updated content. Think about Reels, doom scrolling, right? I'm sure you either do this or you have someone that you know that's constantly like looking at Reels all day long. That's by design. That's to keep you engaged. And that's very much part of a social media company's experience to keep you hooked, right? Governments gather personal data intending to maintain national security. There's always this, how much does the government have on you? How much do they know? How much do they know where you've been? From a digital standpoint, scary. I will tell you this, there was a show on CBS years ago, and I wish they'd bring it back, where they literally had a show, it was a reality show, where they gave people like a 24-hour head start. They would say, okay, Lou, get lost and try to stay hidden for a week or 2 weeks. And if you can stay hidden for 2 weeks, you would win a certain amount of money. Well, you know, I think one person out of like 20 was able to do it, because otherwise we leave a digital footprint everywhere we go, right? We either leave it through our phone, we leave it when we walk in to use our credit card, we leave it when we're driving on the highway, and there are cameras everywhere, and there's constant surveillance happening. It's really quite interesting how much we cannot stay hidden. And so surveillance states, societies in which governments conduct systematic mass surveillance on their populations. It happens here, guys. I'm not trying to be like, you know, black helicopters in the sky or anything. But the fact is that there are cameras everywhere, and we're leaving a digital footprint everywhere on a daily basis. Really hard to get completely off the grid. how about the digital divide? This is the last thing I'm going to talk about. Then we'll be done with this, with chapter 2. Universal access, the notion that every citizen, regardless of income or location, should have the opportunity to use and benefit from a technology, right? Should everyone have access to social media? Should everyone have access to internet? I certainly think there's a, if we go way back to chapter 1 and we talk about sort of like the people that early on knew how to write versus those that didn't, that knew how to read versus those that didn't, there was an inherent like advantage in being on that side, on the educated side. I would say there's definitely an inherited advantage in terms of a modern society being connected through the internet, through social media, through the digital universe. I think that society we had to all go on Zoom and go virtual, and there were people that could easily afford that, and there were people that couldn't. And so then you had government step in to try to provide laptops to students that couldn't afford, families that couldn't afford, computers or whatnot. It was definitely an issue then. There's also what's called the gray digital divide, which is the challenges faced by older citizens who are less likely than younger people to feel comfortable using new digital technologies. I mean, think about, Apple Pay and things that you use with your, you walk in and just, you put your phone next to something, or you scan an image so that you can get more information. That can be intimidating to someone that did not grow up with this at all. And I use my stepfather as an example. My stepfather, who died, about 15 years ago now, we bought him a computer and he never used it. He was intimidated by it. So it's true. But I think as the older that, like me, I'm 59, right? I'm the next man up, if you will, for that generation. We kind of grew up around the internet, so I think it's a little bit easier for us. But still, there are things that you guys, your age group does that my kids do that, my kids are 19 and 22 years old. They're just so much more comfortable with certain things that I am. I just, it is what it is. So I want to show you something here. These are numbers about internet usage and who's kind of most connected and who isn't. And you can see that, for example, take North America, which is right here. North America, 347 million internet users, and that includes North America being Canada and US. Almost 94% of the population has access to internet. That's a tremendous amount versus, for example, Africa only has 43%. Asia, just 67%. So these are legitimate gaps. Now the gaps have come down. If I'd shown you this same stat from 2016, the difference was even much more stark. But the thing is that there's a clear advantage living in Europe, the US, those are the two highest, versus other areas of the world where the internet, quote unquote, internet penetration is far less. All right, well, that does it for chapter 2. I don't think I said the magic word, so here it is. Thanks for listening, but magic word, you ready? Starbucks, Starbucks, Starbucks. Okay, that's your word, Starbucks. All right, guys, have a great day. We'll see you when we do chapter 3.